in what we use to assess how susceptible some misinformation. Okay. So what happens then is that cross-study comparability is pretty difficult, because how do we know that a measure of misinformation susceptibility that uses a particular headline set that uses images, et cetera, is comparable to a different method? Okay. And as I said before, like lacking, we don't have currently, well, a standardized measure of misinformation susceptibility. So what we did was we created the Misinformation Susceptibility Test, which is the first sort of psychometrically validated test of misinformation susceptibility. And this was led by a PhD student at our lab, Carlo Martini, and Friedrich Goetz, who is now at the University of British Columbia in Canada, to give them their due credit. And what we did was we created a set of headlines, basically did a psychometric test, a series of psychometric tests to make sure that these headlines measure the construct of misinformation susceptibility. And just to make sure that we're not accidentally measuring something else, we also correlated the misinformation susceptibility test with other measures that are used quite often. For example, the paper in Psychological Science by Gordon Pennycook and colleagues from 2020 about the accuracy nudge. Correlations for that are 0.59 and up, Pearson's, I believe. This is from memory, so don't quote me on that, but by and large, so really, really high correlation between the MIST, as we call it, which German speakers might find funny, and other item sets that have been used. And we validated the misinformation susceptibility test across different countries. Here it says the US and the UK, but also Nigeria and India, which are two English-speaking countries that are not weird, as you call it, right? Okay. If you're interested in reading more about this, I won't be talking about the misinformation susceptibility test specifically, but we have a link to a preprint for that. It's in the second round of review, but we have a preprint out that you're very welcome to read and give comments on also, and I'm happy to send the link if you're interested. Either way, what does that look like? So the misinformation susceptibility test, the MIST, consists of 20 items, takes about 2 minutes to complete the items, and there are 10 fake, false headlines and 10 real headlines. I'm happy to discuss more about how we created that, but I'm sort of conscious of time. Participants rate each headline as real or fake, right? And then we have 3 metrics that sort of overall provide a construct of how accurate they are at identifying misinformation and telling apart misinformation and non-misinformation. So veracity discernment, right? VDA, meaning accuracy in distinguishing true and false headlines. The fake news score, accuracy in identifying false headlines, and the real news score, accuracy in identifying true headlines. Okay. We also have a short form, which consists of 8 items, which is basically the 8 best performing for true, for false headlines from the 20 item MIST. Okay. What does that look like? This is the MIST 8. Here you see the 8 headlines. Again, I won't go into detail about the content of the headlines. Point being, we started out with about 400 and arrived at 20, sort of process of elimination kind of thing. Okay. Right. That doesn't completely answer our question about cross-study comparability, however, because not only do people use different headline sets, which is sort of by necessity, but there's also great variability in terms of the question framings and the response modes that people use. For example, we've used how reliable is this headline, but David Rand and Gordon Pennycook tend to use how accurate is this headline, how manipulative, how trustworthy, and so on, right? So that's one problem. The second one is some studies use a binary scale, like we just said, right? Real or fake, 2 points. There's 6-point scales, there's 7-point scales, etc. It just goes on and on. What we wanted to know was, does that matter, right? Does this variability specifically, not the headline set variability, but this variability, does that make any difference in terms of how we measure misinformation susceptibility? Okay, so we thought that was a fairly important question to address at least. So to test this, we collaborated with Stefan Herzog, who is here listening in on Zoom, I believe. and his colleagues also Rolf Curvers, Michael Gies, and Mubashir Sultan. And I'll briefly explain what we did. This is the paper that was just accepted. So if you're interested in citing it, here it is, in judgment and decision-making. We collected a sample of about 2,600 participants and randomly assigned each participant to one of 8 conditions. And in each condition, participants rated the 20 missed headlines, right? But depending on the condition, we varied either the question framing or the response mode, or both, right? Okay. They also indicated their confidence levels, which I won't discuss here, and Stefan will be able to say much more about that. But we also included a bunch of questions that are about age and gender, but also some scales, open-mindedness, cognitive reflection, etc. And what we hypothesized was there's no major variation between conditions when it comes to participants' missed scores. If you standardize the accuracy of, for example, veracity discernment across conditions, the variability should be minor. Hopefully that'd be great, right? What did we find? This, very briefly put, on the y-axis, you have your score, so your accuracy on the left, veracity discernment, in the middle, real news detection, and on the right, fake news detection, fake news score. Is there major variability? Not really, right? It is a bit of difference, basically. And that's sort of the main argument of our paper. You can't say that there's no variability whatsoever. There is some, especially here, right? So you see, you won't be able to read it from the back maybe, but on the right here, we have the binary scale, like real or fake. That's the only one that seems to be slightly different from the other 7 conditions, which are 6.7 point scales, accuracy, manipulativeness, reliability, trustworthiness, etc. So that's good news, meaning at the very least, the use of different response modes and different question framings is not expected to have a major influence on how the misinformation susceptibility scores that people display. Okay, interesting, good to know. Not the only thing that we were able to do with this study, however. Again, there's also a section on confidence, which I'll leave to Stefan Herzog. But one of the things that we did also was, over the years, people have identified a bunch of predictors of what makes people susceptible to misinformation, right? Analytical thinking or cognitive reflection is a really famous one, right? Pennycook and Rand have published a lot on the role of cognitive reflection over the years. Then there's open-mindedness or myside bias, if you want to call it that. So actively open-minded thinking, if you're familiar with it, the John Barron scale tends to measure sort of myside bias, how likely someone is to sort of stick to their own guns. Numeracy skills, that's a paper that we published 2 years ago, where we found that the biggest predictor of reduced susceptibility to misinformation about COVID was how good someone is at a numeracy task. Okay. And then the final one is identity related. So political partisanship in this case, which is very important in the United States. Not so much in other countries, but in the United States, there's a big dichotomy between the left and the right. And so Jay van Bavel, for example, but also Bertrand Gavronsky, in a reanalysis of the lazy not biased paper that he published, notes that partisanship plays a pretty big role. Okay. We created the MIST using differential item functioning, and we did that based on ideology. So we checked if the misinformation susceptibility test works the same for liberals and conservatives, just to rule out that that is a potential factor, just noting that. But because the study that we did included so many different ways of measuring misinformation susceptibility, and we used a psychometrically validated instrument, we thought that this was a really good way to check, okay, which of these predictors, these 4 that I'm mentioning here, is the most robust. Okay, here's the figure. Basically what you see here is on the top left, actively open-minded thinking, top right, cognitive reflection test, bottom left, numeracy test performance, and bottom right, political ideology partisanship. Okay. The strongest predictor is open-mindedness, by far. In all conditions, it was by far the strongest predictor. Second strongest, partisanship. Okay. Third strongest, numeracy test performance. And fourth strongest, cognitive reflection performance. Interesting. So by political ideology, I mean that conservatives in the US were more susceptible to misinformation than liberals. Interestingly, cognitive reflection didn't matter at all, except as you can maybe see here, that red line that you see at the top, right? That's the one condition, that's the binary real versus fake condition. There, cognitive reflection was a significant predictor, but still smaller than open-mindedness and partisanship. I've noticed quite a few papers recently discussing the role of actively open-minded thinking in misinformation susceptibility, and I'm just sort of throwing it out there. Is there something like a consensus emerging about this? Which, don't need to discuss that in great detail, but here we are. Okay, now second part of the talk. Now that we have some idea of what makes people susceptible to misinformation, how do we reduce it? Okay, so some of you might know that we've been working on these inoculation games, but just to very briefly reiterate, inoculation basically says you want to reduce the probability that someone falls for misinformation or misleading information, right? And what we focused on is, as I think Anastasia mentioned earlier, not necessarily true versus false, but rather, does the information or the social media post or whatever make use of a particular manipulation technique? For example, a logical fallacy or something else, right? You can sort of reasonably, objectively identify as being misleading or manipulative, right? That's sort of the benchmark that we're setting. Staying away from this dichotomy between true and false, as discussed earlier, because it's really difficult to determine what that even is, right? Okay. So psychological inoculation is quite old, from the 1960s. The idea is if you provide someone preemptively prior to exposure to misinformation with a warning of an impending threat, as well as a preemptive refutation, that increases someone's psychological resistance against future actual exposure to misinformation. Right. What we did was we worked with Google Jigsaw, which is a research team at Google. And we, instead of videos, created, instead of games, we created a series of very short videos. How am I for time?
So you talked for about 18 minutes.
Okay, I'll skip this then. You can watch it. There's a website that we have about it. The point is, we wanted to make sure that we could scale this inoculation approach. So these videos all tackle a particular manipulation technique. And here they are, but I'll sort of jump through it a little bit. We conducted 6 lab studies and a field study. And the lab studies, this is again, just been not accepted, but very close to being accepted in Science Advances. So we got the email this morning and the editor was like, yeah, it's fine, just fix a few things. So very nice to hear that, but it's been under review for like a year and a half. So, you know, it's about time. Either way, we did 6 studies, 1 for each of these videos that we've created, plus a replication. And we had about 1,000 participants per study. 2 conditions, treatment and control. Treatment watches one of these videos, control watches a random unrelated video. And we had an item rating task assessing how good people are at recognizing manipulation techniques, their confidence in their ability to do so, their assessment of the trustworthiness of this type of content, and their sharing intentions, right? We focused on discernment, which is a common measure within misinformation research, the ability to tell apart one from the other. Okay. These are the item rating tasks we created. We won't go into detail about that. And these are the results. So very briefly put, we found in all 5 videos strongly increased technique recognition, if you want to call it that. Confidence was increased in 4 out of 5. The assessment of the trustworthiness was updated in 4 out of 5 studies, and the sharing intentions in 3 out of 5 studies, with a medium to high effect size up to Cohen's d of 0.68. The non-significant effects we hypothesize are because the control group is simply better at spotting ad hominem attacks than other logical fallacies, for example. Okay. Interestingly, or importantly, some interventions appear to be moderated by factors such as political partisanship. So some interventions work much better for liberals than they do for conservatives. Okay. So we wanted to check, is that the case for these videos too? Here you have the effects plotted per study for left-wingers, moderates, and right-wingers. And you can see that except for this one, the emotional language video for moderates, it works for every subgroup. I have no idea why moderates don't work. Could be a fluke, no clue. But also for different levels of analytical thinking, we find exactly the same. So basically we find no consistent moderation effects, which is great. Now I'll finish up with the ecological validity. So lab studies we think are very nice, right? But they don't really say very much about what actually happens in the real world, because real world environments can be very, very noisy, let's say. So what we wanted to do was make sure that we test these interventions in a manner that is ecologically valid, meaning you run a campaign that you actually would run in the real world. If you're, let's say, a policymaker, you want to run a campaign, an anti-misinformation campaign with one of these videos. We wanted to test that rather than having to take additional steps before it's ready for rollout. And what we did was we ran a YouTube ad campaign with 2 of the 5 videos that we created. And we administered, so basically people on YouTube, random users, watched an inoculation video. And within sort of 24 hours of watching this video, they saw a single item survey question, which is called YouTube Brand Lift. It's used for brands really to increase sort of brand recognition. We used it for this, which is we showed people a headline and we asked them to identify what manipulation technique is being used, right? Okay, and we had a control group as well. And the control group didn't get an inoculation video, but they did get a survey question. Okay, so basically we used the videos to run an anti-misinformation campaign on YouTube with 22,000 survey participants in the end. And these are the results. On the top left, you have the emotional language video, and then bottom left is the false dichotomies video, and these are the individual items. And so item 1 for the emotional language video didn't work. The other items did, basically, and what that results in is about a 5% increase in technique recognition, even in an environment like YouTube. And this is highly significant, sort of very, very low p-value. So we're very happy to find that, because you can expect a really strong reduction in the effectiveness of certain interventions when you translate them from lab to field, but not all the way. So that's a really good thing, I think, that we still find this effectiveness, even in a very noisy environment like that. Right. If you're interested in sort of following what's going on here, there's a website we created, inoculation.science, where we have a lot of the interventions available, and you can sort of see what's going on with that. Thank you so much. I know I've talked for too long. I apologize about that, but thank you so much for listening.
We have plenty of time for questions. So, any questions? Yes, please.
So thank you. That was very, very interesting. I have 2 questions, if I am allowed the time. The first was about the different measures that you compared. So I noticed that the binary measure was the one that behaved quite differently from all the rest.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether you have an explanation, whether you thought about it, you know, what does it mean, and does it have to do with the way people represent maybe truth and falsehood? And, you know, I was just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
It's a good question. I think, I don't know, honestly. I think it's good to tease that out, like do a separate study or something on whether that is consistent. That's one thing, but also why that might be. Right? I think it could be that if you're forcing people into one of 2 options, that analytical thinking becomes more important than if you give them sort of an option of like a scale or 7 points or something like that. I'm not completely convinced by that, but it's a possibility. So the answer is no clue. I'm sorry.
So let's take the next question from the room.
Yes. She has a second question.
But it's okay. I mean, I can go at the end.
Please go ahead so I can ask the questions as well.
Okay. So the other question was about the effect of the myside bias. So sorry, I didn't catch that. so that's a positive effect in the sense that people with higher myside bias are better. No, it's a...
So on the y-axis, you have veracity discernment. So a higher score means you're better at distinguishing true news from false news. We also looked at fake news and real news individually, and it doesn't change at all. It's all the same. Yeah. And so also it's good to note, like, this regression model is basically ideal, like completely uncorrelated residuals and so on. So we're pretty confident that we're not accidentally measuring something else, I would say.
Right, but so it means that people with higher myside are better able.
No, higher open-mindedness are better able.
Higher open-mindedness.
Yeah, so lower myside bias.
It's open-mindedness, not myside bias. Okay.
Yeah, apologies for the confusion.
So I thought this was interesting because, you know, there are two ways to think about it. So people who are good at thinking about others might be more well, attentive to the fact that there is misinformation or about the intents of others. But on the other hand, I mean, you could expect also the opposite. So maybe we can discuss this later, but I would be interested to hear more about the reasoning behind this pattern.
Yeah. Let's discuss later because there's a lot to say, I think.
Yeah.
The question is very related, and I join Milton saying that I find this amazing. Higher open-mindedness, it's related to less susceptibility. I find it almost counterintuitive. And related to this, I was wondering if either in your studies or in the literature there is any side effect related to inoculation. So we want people to not be gullible, but we want people to be open-minded.
Yeah.
And I can't see this as a side effect. Do you have any?
The only side effect that I think that I've seen really that shows up multiple times is you can on occasion increase skepticism of real news. Basically, that seems to be a thing that happens quite a lot across all sorts of interventions. But basically, if people learn how to distinguish true from false information, at the very least initially, they also become a bit more skeptical of information that is in principle reliable. Now, you can have a discussion about how bad that is, right? Is that something we want to avoid or maybe not avoid? Don't have an answer to that necessarily, but that seems to be a side effect. So people update their beliefs about false news, but also about true news, albeit to a lesser extent, and those effects don't seem to last as long, interestingly. So there's that. Otherwise, I haven't really seen inoculation sort of have any adverse effects really that you classify as negative, but I can check again, I guess.
We have some questions online. Anastasia.
Yeah, hi, John. Thanks so much for the fascinating talk. Very cool. I have a few questions. Let me try to phrase them. First, a comment. Why do you keep using the term fake news instead of false information? Is there any conceptual reason for that? Because I think this word has been really so co-opted by the likes of Trump and Putin that I would think the field really should move on from this. But okay, that's a minor point. Then what I wanted to ask you is about this psychometric scale MIST, right? That you published on. So what would be the conclusion? Do you recommend using it as a standardized measure for the field? Or do you see any limitations there? Because I think it's just like just the headlines, right? It's very hard to, like, there is no cues there that people can use to make a judgment, right? Like, how do you even decide what is the ground truth there in these statements? And then a minor question I had is about, well, not a minor question, but maybe something I missed in your presentation. So this inoculation videos, they had an impact on your participants, right? But did you also notice any partisan differences in this? So did, for instance, Republicans were as likely to improve as Democrats or not? Like, related to your other point that there is a susceptibility and there is a partisan bias in misinformation in general. So it would be, I think it would be a very cool finding if it turns out that there is a partisan bias in susceptibility, but they all improve equally, for instance.
Yeah, about fake news. Yeah, I agree that like fake news is a bit outdated. So we tend to use misinformation. The reason I use fake and real in this misinformation susceptibility test is mainly the headlines that we used for the misinformation susceptibility test were false and true. So we fed GPT-2 a bunch of false headlines basically, and it spit out a bunch of sort of generated false headlines, and that's what we use. Before I go into too much detail and talk for too long, I'm happy to send over the link, Anastasia, to the paper where we discuss that in like a lot of detail. But I agree that fake news should probably be retired, also because I don't necessarily think that truth value is the best benchmark, I guess, for deciding what counts and doesn't count as misinformation. Second question, what was your second question again?
Was about the MIST scale. Do you recommend it as a standardized measure? What is the ground truth?
Right. So would I recommend it as a covariate for sure? As an outcome variable, that is to be determined. So it's safe to use, I think, as a way to assess, for example, okay, does this intervention work for people who are low and high in misinformation susceptibility, let's say? For that, it's really good. We're also creating a few other psychometrically validated scales that tackle not necessarily true versus false, but for example, manipulative versus non-manipulative. But that's to be done. We're not quite done with that yet. So I think it's safe to use. It's also, I would say, but I'm completely biased, it's a pretty good, I would say, measure of, like, that measures an actual construct rather than a sort of some ad hoc measure. So that's okay. And then about the intervention. So yes, the learning effect basically is about the same for Republicans and Democrats. So that's quite nice to see. I think that you do notice quite strongly like an initial difference in misinformation susceptibility. So here you go, I'll show it. Here. So you do notice, for example, that on the right, the starting point, so the y-axis shows discernment, right? It's lower, generally speaking, than for the left, which is consistent across basically every misinformation study. But the update, like the difference between control and inoculation here, is broadly speaking, I would say similar, meaning almost the same, if not the same. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very nice to see.
First question, there's some research in linguistics that think that fake news is being used as a slur.
Yeah.
So it's more like calling someone an idiot. You're not really describing something, but it's just deliberate. So maybe that
yeah, no, I agree. So that's also why we tend to use misinformation in whatever we describe.
So we have a few minutes for one last question, and Thomas online was Thomas, please.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Jon. This is really great food for thought. I was thinking, since you find that open-mindedness is such an important aspect, have you done any correlation with if it actually, to what extent your inoculation interventions may impact open-mindedness among the participants?
It's a very good question. So we've thought about this. To my knowledge, there aren't really any interventions that explicitly target open-mindedness, but that seems to be something very much worth thinking about, I would say. Maybe there's an indirect effect of, like, if an intervention improves open-mindedness, according to that scale, maybe it also improves misinformation recognition. Who knows? But I haven't seen that necessarily. I can check. I honestly didn't use it as an outcome measure, just as a covariate, but I can always check the data to see if anything's there. But it would be like fishing for conclusions a little bit, so I'd be hesitant about it. But I can check. Yeah.
Yeah, because one hypothesis would actually, since you are talking about how you become more skeptical towards real news. When you do inoculation, sometimes this happens. I know that your partners have been finding this. Yeah. And what we are finding in our studies is that people who say that it's really important to read credible news, they are the ones who are always scoring the best when we're asking them to navigate misinformation. And I'm thinking that that's probably something that has to do with open-mindedness as well. It's sort of a humility score, open-mindedness item or scale. But I'm thinking that it could be super interesting to better map out if inoculation is actually nudging or pushing the open-mindedness in some way. And the hypothesis would be that they might actually be going the other way around, but they would still become better at identifying items. So yeah, if you haven't done it, do it. It would be really interesting, and then design an experiment around it.
Yep. Yeah, very good idea. I'll do that, and I'll send you the results. Thanks.
Excellent.